Hey, it's Nathan. Welcome back to Storylab. I want to start today with a question that has almost nothing to do with violence and everything to do with marriage. When was the last time you asked the person sleeping next to you what they used to be? Not what they do now, what they were. Because people build whole second lives on top of their first ones, and the second life is usually the boring one, the one with the work van and the coffee stain and the school pickup line, and after a while everybody stops looking underneath it. The story I'm telling you today is about a man who spent 22 years doing something extremely specific, extremely quietly, and then spent the next decade fixing refrigerators in a small Indiana town because he wanted his kids to have a father who came home at 6. His wife looked at that van in the driveway and decided she had married a small man. She never once asked him what came before it, not in 14 years. And when she finally decided she wanted him gone, she priced him like the van. I'm going to be honest with you up front. There is a body at the end of this story, and it is not his. Stay with me all the way through, because the last 30 seconds of this one changed how I think about the word underestimate. Let's get into it. Bardo Springs, Indiana had one traffic light, 2 churches that did not speak to each other, and a diner that opened at 5 in the morning for men who worked before the sun. Abram Duvall was usually the 4th truck in the lot. He was 47. He drove a white service van with Duvall Commercial Refrigeration stenciled on the side in letters he had paid a sign shop $200 for 11 years earlier and never updated. Inside the van, everything lived in a place. Gauges in the left drawer. Brazing rods standing in a length of PVC pipe he had cut and capped himself. Nitrogen bottle strapped upright behind the wheel well, because a loose bottle in a crash is a torpedo, and he had seen a photograph once, in another life, of what a torpedo does to a man's spine. His work was ice machines and walk-in coolers. That was it. That was the whole business. When a restaurant's walk-in climbed above 40 degrees at 11 at night, somebody's entire inventory started dying, and Abram was the man they called, and he answered, and he came. He had built the business on exactly one promise. He picked up the phone. 14 years of picking up the phone had made him the most quietly indispensable man in 3 counties, and almost nobody in those 3 counties could have told you a single interesting thing about him. That was on purpose. Abram had 2 children. Landry was 11, all elbows, obsessed with a used metal detector he had bought with lawn money, convinced that southern Indiana was hiding Civil War silver under every fence line. Kimber was 8 and had recently decided she was going to be a veterinarian for large animals only, because, in her words, small animals had enough people. On Saturdays, Abram let them ride in the van on service calls. Landry held the flashlight. Kimber narrated. He would be lying under a condenser unit behind a Mexican restaurant with his hands black to the wrist and hear his daughter explaining to a line cook that her dad could fix anything with a motor in it, and he would think, "This is it. This is the whole thing. I built the right life." His wife Deanna did not ride in the van. They had been married 14 years. She sold real estate out of a storefront office on the square with her own name on the glass, and she was good at it, genuinely good. The kind of agent who could walk a hesitant couple through a bad kitchen and make them see a better one. She had a laugh she used on clients. Over the years, Abram had noticed she used it on him too. The Whitcombs were a Bardo Springs family in the way some families are a town's weather. Deanna's mother, Bridget, had opinions about everyone's landscaping. Her brother Wheeler sold insurance and drove a truck he could not afford. At Sunday dinners, when someone asked what Abram did, Bridget liked to answer for him. "Abe fixes freezers," she would say, and let the sentence sit there like a plate nobody wanted. Abram never corrected her, not once in 14 years. Here is what Bridget Whitcomb did not know, because she never asked. At 18, Abram Duvall enlisted in the Marine Corps. At 23, he was a black belt instructor trainer in the Corps' martial arts program, which is a title that sounds decorative until you understand what it actually means. He was the man who certified the men who taught everyone else. He spent 6 years turning 19-year-olds who had never been hit into people who could function after they were. Then he got out, and a man he had trained under hired him into a federal training center in the New Mexico desert, and for 16 years after that, Abram taught close-quarters defense to federal air marshals. Think about what that job actually is. A marshal fights in an aisle 19 inches wide, at 30,000 feet, surrounded by strangers, where a missed strike hits a child, and where you cannot step back because there is no back. There is no sport in it, no ring, no space. Everything Abram taught for 16 years was built for a corridor, for a doorway, for a stairwell, for the exact geometry of a house. He taught it for 16 years, 22 years in uniform and in that gym, all told. And in all that time he had exactly 2 rules he repeated so often his students put them on a laminated card in the break room. The first, the loudest man in the room is never the most dangerous one. The second, you do not rise to the occasion. You fall to your training, and then you fall to what you built before the door opened. Abram left that world at 41, after a student of his died in a hotel parking lot in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with luck. And he came home to Indiana, and he bought a van, and he decided that for the rest of his life, he was going to be extremely boring on purpose. He did not tell people. It was not a secret exactly. It was just that nobody asked, and a man who spent 22 years teaching people to be unremarkable until the moment they were not, does not walk into a Sunday dinner and announce himself. Deanna knew he had been in the Marines. She knew he had worked for the government in New Mexico and had not liked to talk about it. Somewhere in year 3 she had stopped asking, and somewhere in year 7 she had started telling people he had done training work, in a tone that suggested paperwork. 8 months before the night the police kicked in his door, Abram's mother died. Roseanne Duvall went the way she had lived, without asking anyone for help, on a Tuesday, in her chair, with a crossword half finished. She left her son 214 acres on the West Fork of the river that her own father had bought in 1948 for the price of a good truck. Locals called it Strawn Hollow. It was hills, hardwood, a creek that ran clear even in August, a collapsing barn with the initials ES carved into the loft beam, and no value at all to anyone who wanted money out of it. That was in March. In September, a letter came from the state about a proposed bypass, and everything about that worthless land changed. Abram found the letter on the kitchen counter, opened, resealed badly, 3 days after the postmark. He did not say anything about it. He just noticed. It was the first thing he noticed. The bypass was a nothing project on paper, a 14-mile connector meant to pull gravel trucks off the county road, and it had been dying in committee for 9 years. What changed was a rail spur. A logistics company bought 40 acres east of town for a distribution hub. The state suddenly had a reason to fund the connector, and the connector needed an interchange, and the only geography that made an interchange possible was the flat shelf where the West Fork bent. That shelf was on Abram's 214 acres. Then the second thing. A survey crew doing soil borings for the state hit a seam of construction sand and gravel under the hollow, 11 feet down, running who knew how far. Aggregate is not glamorous. Aggregate is also the single most boring way to become wealthy in rural America, because every road, every foundation, and every distribution hub within 60 miles has to buy it from whoever is closest, and freight cost means closest wins. By the first week of October, a man from an aggregate company had left 3 voicemails, and a land group out of Indianapolis had offered $4.2 million for an option Abram did not return a call about. Deanna returned the calls. She did it the way she did everything, efficiently and with a story ready. She told him she had only wanted to know what they were dealing with. She had a folder, she had comps. She had, she said, done him a favor, because the first offer is always low and now they knew the shape of the thing. Abram sat at the kitchen table and looked at the folder and said the sentence that started everything. "I'm not selling it." He tried to explain it. His grandfather had bought that ground with $140 and a borrowed trailer. The initials in the barn beam were Elias Strawn, his mother's father, a man who had cut every board in that barn by hand and who had once walked 11 miles in January to buy a bull. Abram wanted his kids to have a place with their own name in the wood. He wanted Landry to get old enough to understand that some things do not have a price, because the price is not the point. He said all of that badly, because he was not a man who talked much, and by the end of it, Deanna was looking at him the way you look at a repairman who has quoted you a number you think is invented. $4 million, she said. More like 6, he said. Probably more, if the interchange goes. I know, she said. That was where it turned. Not at the yelling. Later. Right there, in the quiet part. Griffith Sutherland came into their life 11 days after that conversation, and he came in the front door, invited, wearing a jacket that cost more than Abram's van payment. Sutherland was 52, silver at the temples, with the specific warmth of a man who has learned that warmth closes deals faster than pressure. Sutherland Land Group had put up 2 strip centers, a self-storage complex and a subdivision called Copperbend that had drainage problems he had settled quietly. He knew every county commissioner by their kids' names. He listed his properties with Deanna's agency, which was how it started, and he told her at a chamber lunch that she was the only agent in the county who understood entitlements, which was a compliment shaped exactly like a hook. He came to dinner. He complimented Abram's smoked chicken. He asked, with what looked like real interest, about the refrigeration business, and he listened to the answer, and he asked a good follow-up question about compressor cycling, and Abram thought, this man is very good at this, and filed it. Because here is the thing nobody understood about Abram Duvall. 16 years of teaching people to read a threat in a 19-inch aisle does not leave you. He did not get suspicious. Suspicion is emotional and loud. He got observant, which is quiet, and much worse for the person being observed. So he noticed. He noticed that Deanna's phone, which had lived face up on every surface of their house for 14 years, now lived face down. He noticed a second charging cable in her car console, white, not the brand she used. He noticed that her mileage between Tuesday and Thursday had started running 70 miles higher than her showings could account for, because he was a man who tracked oil changes on a clipboard. He noticed that she had begun to smell faintly, twice, of a truck cab that used a cedar air freshener, and their vehicles did not. And in the 3rd week of October, she asked him a question, in bed, in the dark, in a soft voice that made the skin on the back of his arms go cold. Do we still have that policy from when the kids were born? He said yes. He said it was small, 300,000, group rate through the trade association. He said it was probably worth reviewing. She said, and rolled over, and was asleep in 4 minutes, and Abram lay there in the dark for 2 hours, doing something he had not done in 6 years, which was thinking about geometry. The bedroom door, the hallway, the stairs, the window over the kitchen sink, the gravel. He told himself he was being insane. He told himself that a woman asking about life insurance is a woman doing math about mortgages. Then Sunday dinner happened. Wheeler Whitcomb had prepared. He had printed something. He talked about generational opportunity and about how a family gets one shot, and Bridget said that Roseanne would have wanted the grandchildren taken care of, using the voice she used at funerals, and Deanna sat there and let her family run the play she had drawn up. Abram waited until all of it was done. Then he said, in the flat, pleasant voice he used with restaurant owners who wanted to argue about a bill, that the ground was not marital property, that it had come to him by inheritance, that he had no intention of selling it in his lifetime, and that he would be happy to talk about anything else. Bridget said, well, Abe fixes freezers, and now he's a land baron. He smiled at her. That was the part Deanna could not stand. He smiled. In the truck on the way home, with the kids asleep in the back, Deanna said, quietly, so it would not wake them, you have been a small man your entire life, and you finally got handed something big, and you're going to sit on it until it rots, because that's the only thing you know how to do. Abram drove. He watched the county road come at the headlights. He said, I know what I am. She said, no, you don't. She meant it as an insult. 4 months later, on a Thursday night in October, he would think about that sentence with something close to sympathy. He did not sleep that night. Around 2 he went downstairs and sat in the kitchen without turning the light on, and he did the thing that would eventually save all their lives, which was that he stopped defending the marriage in his head and started thinking about his children. Not about what she might do. He was not there yet. Just about what would happen to Landry and Kimber if something happened to him. On Monday, he called a lawyer. Lisbeth Mercier practiced out of a converted house 2 blocks off the square, with a paralegal, a beagle that slept under the conference table, and 30 years of estate work behind her. Abram sat across from her on a Monday morning in his work clothes and asked what he thought was a simple question. If I die, what happens to the land? Mercier walked him through it without any drama, which he appreciated. Inherited property stayed his separate property in a divorce, so long as he never commingled it, never put her name on it, never ran the family money through it. She was clean on that. Then she said, "But divorce and death are two completely different animals, Mr. Duvall. You die with no will, and a spouse, and 2 minor children, and Indiana splits it. She takes half. The children split half. In a guardianship, she controls until they are 18. Practically speaking, she runs all of it." Abram was quiet for a while. He asked, "And if I write a will?" She said, "A will helps. A spouse can still elect against it and take a statutory share. If you want that ground to belong to your children and only your children, and you want that to be true no matter what happens to you, you don't write a will. You put it in an irrevocable trust and you stop owning it." He said, "What does that cost me?" She said, "Control. If it goes in, you can't take it back out. Not if you change your mind, not if you get divorced and want to sell, not if you're 80 and broke." He thought about the initials in the beam. He said, "Set it up." And then he said the sentence that turned out to matter more than any other decision he made in his life. "Don't tell anyone. Not the office, not the county, not a courtesy letter to my wife. Nobody." Mercier looked at him for a moment over her glasses. She said, "Mr. Duvall, is there a reason for that?" He said, "I don't know yet." The trust was signed on the 7th of November. Strawn Hollow, all 214 acres, plus the shop building and the business assets, went into an irrevocable trust for the benefit of Landry and Kimber Duvall. Mercier was the trustee. There was a standard slayer clause, the ordinary language that says nobody who unlawfully causes a person's death can profit from that death. And there was one unusual provision Abram asked for himself, after thinking about it for 4 days. If both children died before reaching majority, the entire trust went to a land conservancy, permanently, as an easement. Not to a spouse, not to a family, to the trees. He was not thinking about murder when he asked for that. He would say later, on a witness stand, that he was thinking about a car accident and about what people do to each other over money when they are grieving. But what he had built, without knowing it, was a machine with no reward in it. Whatever happened to Abram Duvall, from November 7th forward, nobody made $1 off his death. He drove out to the hollow that Saturday and took Landry with him. It was that flat gold November light, the kind that makes hardwood look like it is burning without heat. They walked the fence line with the metal detector because Landry insisted, and found 11 bottle caps, a horseshoe, and a 1943 steel penny that Landry treated like a relic of a lost civilization. They ate sandwiches on the tailgate. Kimber had stayed home because she had a birthday party, and Abram remembered later being glad about that, and then feeling strange about being glad. In the barn, he put his son's hand on the loft beam and made him feel the initials. "E.S.," he said, "Elias Strawn, your great-grandfather." He cut this beam with a saw he sharpened himself. Landry said, "Is it true it's worth like $1 million?" Abram said, "More than that." Landry said, "Are we rich?" Abram said, "No. We own something. That's different. Rich is what you have. Owning is what you keep." His son thought about that for approximately 4 seconds, and then asked if they could get a metal detector that went deeper. They were pulling out through the gate when Abram saw the stakes. Survey stakes, pink ribbon, 6 of them, driven in a line across the shelf where the creek bent, right where an interchange would want to go. They were new. The dirt at their bases had not weathered. On the gate post, where he had put a chain and a lock in March, somebody had cut the chain, laid it back over the post, and looped it so that it would look closed from a moving vehicle. Abram stood there with the cut chain in his hand for a long time. Landry said, "Dad?" He said, "It's fine. Get in the truck." He drove home doing math that had nothing to do with money. Somebody had walked his ground with a surveyor. Getting a survey crew onto private land costs money and requires somebody to tell them it's authorized. That means somebody signed something, or said something, with enough confidence that a professional believed they had the right. That night he sat in the van in his own driveway for 20 minutes with the engine off, looking at his own house. kitchen light, upstairs hall light, his daughter's window with the paper stars she had taped up. He was a man who had spent 16 years teaching people that the fight starts long before the fight starts. He went inside, and he kissed his wife on the temple, and he said nothing at all, and he began, quietly, to prepare his house. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday in December, at 6:04 in the evening, a man Abram had not seen in 14 years walked into his shop. Abram was at the parts counter closing out invoices. He heard the door, said "We're closed," then looked up. The man in the doorway was heavy through the shoulders, mid-40s, in a canvas jacket with a company logo on the chest, and he had the face of somebody who had been outside for 20 years. He stood in the doorway the way men stand when they are not sure they are going to be allowed to stay. He said, "Instructor Duvall." Nobody had called him that in 6 years. Dermot Kepler had come to the Federal Training Center in New Mexico in 2011 as a candidate with a good record and a bad situation at home. He was strong, fast, and completely unable to keep his hands down when he got angry, and Abram had failed him on the 4th week, which was the correct call, and he had watched the kid sit in a parking lot afterward for 2 hours with his forehead on the steering wheel. Most instructors go home. Abram had gone out to the parking lot and gotten in the passenger seat and asked him what he was going to do now. Kepler had said something that Abram had heard before from men in that seat, which is that he did not see the point of anything anymore. Abram had driven him to a diner, bought him eggs, sat with him until 2 in the morning, and then called a friend in Amarillo who ran a demolition outfit, and Kepler had a job on Monday. That was the last time they had spoken. Now Kepler stood in an Indiana refrigeration shop with his hands hanging at his sides, and after a long moment, he took a folded paper out of his jacket and put it on the counter and slid it across, and did not let go of it right away. He said, "I need you to look at that, and then I need you to let me talk for 5 minutes before you do anything." Abram unfolded it. It was a job sheet. Kepler Site Services, Site Clearing and Demolition. There was a scope line, a price, a date range, and in the address field, typed, correct down to the rural route, was Abram's home address. Stapled behind it was a photograph, printed on plain paper, slightly grainy, taken from a vehicle. It showed a boy and a girl standing at the end of a driveway in the morning, waiting for a bus. Abram looked at the picture of his children for exactly as long as it took to memorize the angle it was taken from, which told him where the vehicle had been parked, which was the Orbison place, which had been empty since August. Then he set it down, folded his hands on the counter, and said, in a voice Kepler would later describe to a jury as the calmest voice he had ever heard in his life, "Talk." What Kepler told him took closer to 40 minutes than 5. Kepler Site Services was a real company with 11 employees, 4 excavators, and a yard outside Terre Haute. It cleared lots, took down barns, and hauled fill. It also, 3 or 4 times a year, did other work, the kind that never appeared on a job sheet, for developers who needed a problem to stop being a problem. Mostly that meant a holdout tenant discovering his truck on blocks, or a county inspector receiving photographs of himself, or a man who had threatened a lawsuit deciding, after one conversation in his own garage, that he had not. Kepler was careful about it. He had rules. Nobody under 18, nobody in a hospital bed, nobody dies. The work came to him through people who never used their own names, and the money came through invoices that looked exactly like the one on the counter. 9 days earlier, Griffith Sutherland had come to the yard. Sutherland did not say the word kill. Men like Sutherland do not use verbs. He said there was a situation involving a landowner who was blocking a 9-figure corridor project, that the man's wife was a partner in the solution, that the family would be far better off, and that the outcome needed to look like something that happens in the country when people leave doors unlocked. He said the number twice, both times attached to a completely different sentence, the way you leave a tip on a table without acknowledging it. $40,000. Half up front, structured as 3 site-clearing draws on a parcel Sutherland actually owned, so the money moved through a bank looking like dirt work. Kepler had said he would think about it, because saying no immediately to a man like that is its own kind of announcement. He had taken the job packet home, and that night, at his kitchen table, He had opened it and read the target's name. Duvall, Abram T. He said, sitting there in that shop, that he had gone out to his truck and thrown up in his own driveway. Then he said the part that mattered. I can't just refuse. If I hand it back, he takes it to Ostrander in Evansville, or to the Kessler brothers, and they don't have rules, and you won't know their faces, and you won't know when. If I say no, you lose the only thing you've got right now, which is that the man they hired is standing in your shop. Abram had not moved from the counter that entire time. He asked 3 questions, in order, and the order told Kepler everything about what kind of man he was still dealing with. First, has she said any of it herself, in her own voice, or is it all through him? Kepler said, she was at the second meeting. In a car, she talked. Second, what's the timeline? Kepler said, Sutherland wants it before the option deadline, sometime in the next 6 weeks. Third, where's the money right now? Kepler said, first draw hit my account on Tuesday. Abram nodded slowly. Then he did something that Kepler said he would remember for the rest of his life. He walked over and turned the shop's open sign around, and locked the front door, and came back, and pulled a legal pad out from under the counter, and clicked a pen. He said, take it. Kepler said, what? Abram said, take the job, take all of it, take the rest of the money. Be enthusiastic. Complain about the timeline so she has to argue with you, because people say more when they're arguing. Ask her stupid questions that force her to be specific, and write down every single thing she says to you the same night before you sleep. Kepler said, instructor, you understand what you're asking me to be part of. Abram said, I'm asking you to be the reason my kids have a mother in prison instead of a father in the ground. Then he sat down on a shop stool, and for about 90 seconds he did not say anything at all, and Kepler watched a 47-year-old refrigeration man put his hand over his mouth and hold it there. Then he took his hand down and said, we're going to do this properly, which means we're not doing it ourselves. The Bartow County Sheriff's investigator who caught the case was named Shannon Lattimore. She was 39, 11 years in, and she had exactly one rule about walk-in complaints, which was that people who are lying come in angry, and people who are telling the truth come in tired. Abram Duvall came in tired. He brought the job sheet, the photograph of his children, the cut chain from the gate in a paper sack, his phone with a photograph of the odd mileage on his clipboard log, and Dermot Kepler, who sat down and confessed to a felony conspiracy in the first 90 seconds without being asked, which Lattimore later called the strangest opening of an interview she had ever conducted. The county prosecutor's office sent a deputy named Maricela Brogan, who had done 2 murder-for-hire cases in her career and had lost one of them. Brogan explained the problem to Abram in the plainest terms anybody had used with him yet. She said, right now, I can charge your wife with nothing. A man tells me a developer implied something in a yard. A woman was in a car. There's a photograph of your kids anybody could have taken. If I walk into a courtroom today, her lawyer says Mr. Kepler is a criminal inventing a story to extort a wealthy man, and the jury sends her home, and then she is home, in your house, with your children, forever cautious and forever motivated. Abram said, so what do you need? Brogan said, I need her, in her own voice, agreeing to a specific act, with a specific price, on a specific date, after money has moved. And then I need the act to be attempted and interrupted, in a way that cannot be argued as talk. Lattimore said, and that means we need you inside your own house on the night it happens. There was a silence in that room. Abram said, my children are not going to be there. Brogan said, absolutely not. Everyone in that room agreed on that, on a Tuesday in December, and every one of them meant it, and it turned out to be the only promise in the entire case that nobody could keep. For the next 5 weeks, Abram Duvall lived 2 lives in the same house. He got up at 5. He made coffee. He kissed his wife. He drove to a walk-in cooler at a nursing home in Sullivan County and replaced a fan motor. He came home. He helped Landry with a science project about erosion, and they built a model creek in a plastic tub, and he sat with his son on the garage floor and let sand run through his fingers into the water, and he thought about the shelf at the West Fork. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, at lunch, He sat in a county building conference room with Lattimore and Brogan and a technician from the state police and listened to recordings of his wife's voice. That was the part nobody prepares you for. Not the fear, the recordings. The first one was 17 minutes long, from a wire on Kepler, in a parked car behind a chain restaurant in Terre Haute. Deanna's voice came through slightly muffled by fabric, but perfectly clear, and it was her Sunday voice, the reasonable one, the one she used to explain a septic disclosure to a nervous buyer. She said the house was on a gravel drive with no neighbors within 400 yards. She said he was a heavy sleeper, which was not true, and Abram, listening, understood that she genuinely believed it, which meant she had not really looked at him in years. She said there were no guns in the house, which was true. She said, and this is the part that made the state police technician stop the tape and step out of the room. She said she wanted it to happen while the children were home. Kepler, on the recording, said, no kids. And Deanna said, they'll be upstairs, they'll never see anything, but they'll hear it. And that's what makes it work, because when a sheriff's deputy asks an 8-year-old what happened, and she says men in masks, that's the whole case. Nobody argues with a child. If it's just me telling that story, I'm a wife with a motive. If it's them, I'm a widow. Then she laughed. Not a big laugh, a small one, embarrassed, the kind you make when you have said something you know is ugly, and you want the other person to help you carry it. Abram Duvall sat in a county conference room and listened to his wife laugh about using his children as an alibi. Lattimore said his face did not change at all, and that she had been doing this for 11 years and had never been more frightened by anything in a room. When the tape ended, Abram asked one question. He said, "Can I have a copy of that?" Brogan said, "Absolutely not." He said, "Okay, then play it again." While the recordings piled up, Abram rebuilt his house. He did it the way a man does home projects in January, badly lit and on weekends, and Deanna never asked about a single one of them, because they were all boring. He took down the coat hooks in the back hall and put up a bookcase, deep, anchored into studs, which narrowed the hallway from the kitchen to the stairs by 14 inches. A hallway that is 42 inches wide lets two men move together. A hallway that is 28 inches wide makes them a line, and a line has a front man, and a front man is a door you only have to open once. He replaced the exterior door hardware, all 3 doors, with reinforced strike plates and 3-inch screws that reach the framing. Not to stop anybody, to make them louder and slower and to guarantee that they came in where he wanted them to. He moved the motion light from over the garage to the corner of the shed so that anyone approaching from the road walked out of dark into a light that put their own shadow in their eyes. He raked 11 yards of new gravel into the drive, coarse, and put it heaviest in the 20 feet outside the mudroom door. And in his daughter's closet, he built what he told everyone was a storm room, because Kimber had been terrified of tornado season since a siren went off during a school assembly in 2nd grade. He framed a small room in behind the closet, drywalled it, ran a light and an outlet, put a solid core door on it with a deadbolt on the inside, and stocked it with a flashlight, a case of water, a blanket, and a cheap prepaid cell phone taped inside the light switch cover. Kimber loved it. She put a rug in it. She kept crackers in there and called it the bunker and made her brother knock. Deanna said, "That's very sweet," and did not go in. 10 days before the end, Abram sat on the edge of Landry's bed with the lights off and had the hardest conversation of his life while pretending it was about weather. He said, "If you ever hear glass break in this house at night, you don't come find me." Landry said, "But what if?" Abram said, "There's no what if. You take your sister to the bunker, you lock the door, you turn off the light, and you sit against the far wall, and you do not open that door for anyone. Not for your mom, not for me." His son said, "Why not for you?" And Abram said, "Because if I'm all right, I'll come get you when it's over, and I'll be able to wait. And if somebody's making me say it's all right, I need you to be somewhere I don't have to worry about you." Landry, 11 years old, looked at his father in the dark for a long moment, and then he said, "Okay, Dad," in a small voice, and Abram went out into the hall and stood there with his hand over his eyes. The plan, as of the 14th of January, was clean. The date was set for Thursday the 23rd, Kepler would tell Deanna he was doing it that night. Abram would take the kids to his cousins in Vincennes on Wednesday, an alibi built around a school break. A 4-man state police team plus Lattimore would be in the Orbison house across the road from 9 o'clock. Kepler's crew would arrive, and Kepler would drive, and at the moment of entry the team would take them at the door. Abram would be inside. That was the piece Brogan hated and could not avoid, because a jury needs a victim who was actually there, and because a house with nobody in it is a house where the crew turns around at the mailbox. On Sunday the 19th, everything broke at once. The first break came from money. Griffith Sutherland had borrowed hard against the corridor deal from a lender named Ransom Pelletier out of Louisville, at rates that assumed a fast close, and Pelletier moved his deadline up 30 days. Sutherland now needed the land under contract by the 1st of February, or he lost his 2 strip centers as collateral. So the date moved from Thursday the 23rd to Thursday the 23rd at 9:30 instead of 11, and then, on Tuesday, forward again, and Brogan spent an entire afternoon on the phone rebuilding a surveillance authorization. The second break came from Deanna. On Monday, she canceled the Vincennes trip. She did it beautifully. She told Abram that her cousin's kids had strep, and then she went around him and told the children directly, before she told him, so that by the time he heard it, Kimber had already cried about missing a cousin's dog, and Landry had already been promised a movie night at home instead. And then she told Abram, in the kitchen, with the kids in the next room, that they would go in February. He stood there holding a coffee cup and understood, in real time, that he was being outmaneuvered by a woman who had learned negotiation from him without ever asking him a question about his life. If he fought it, she would know something. If he took the kids anyway, she would know something. If he told the police to call it off, the men were still coming, someday, and he would never see them arrive. Lattimore said, "Absolutely not. We stand it down." Brogan said, "If we stand it down, we lose the wire. We lose Kepler, and she hires the next guy in 6 months." Abram said, "We don't stand down. And my kids will be in a locked room with a steel core door and a phone, on the other side of the house from the entry point, with a police team 90 yards away." There was a silence on that call that Lattimore described later as the longest of her career. The third break came 90 minutes before it happened. At 8 o'clock on Thursday night, Kepler sent a 2-word text from the yard. "He's coming." Griffith Sutherland had decided to be there. He would not explain why. Kepler thought it was because Pelletier had frightened him, and he no longer trusted anyone to do anything correctly. Lattimore thought it was something uglier and simpler, which is that some men need to watch. And the fourth break, the one that made the whole night real, came at 8:50. Kepler's crew chief was a man named Roark, who had done 11 years in Pendleton and had come to work for Kepler out of a work release program, and who did not know anything about any of this. Roark had been told this was a scare job. At 8:50, in the yard, Roark opened his console and put a pistol in his waistband, and when Kepler told him to leave it, Roark said, in front of the other two, that he had never once walked into a house at night without one, and he was not starting tonight. Kepler, wearing a recording device, with 4 state police officers listening, could not push it any further without exposing everything. At 9:09, he sent his last text. 4, one armed, sorry. Abram Duvall read that message standing at the top of his own stairs. Then he went into his daughter's room, where his 2 children were watching a movie on a tablet with the sound low, and he crouched down and said, "Hey, bunker drill, right now, both of you, take the tablet." Landry looked at him, and his son did not ask a single question. He picked up his sister's blanket, took her hand, walked her into the closet, and Abram heard the deadbolt turn, and then, through the door, in the smallest voice, Landry said, "Dad, it's locked." Abram put his palm flat on the door. He said, "I know, buddy. I'll come get you when it's over." Then he went downstairs and turned off the kitchen light, and stood in a 28-inch hallway in the dark, and waited. The van came up the county road at 9:41 with its headlights off. Abram heard it before he saw anything, because a vehicle rolling on a gravel shoulder at 15 miles an hour makes a sound like a slow zipper, and he had spent 3 weeks putting down 11 yards of gravel, specifically so that this sound would exist. He counted doors. 4. He counted footsteps on the drive. 4 sets, and one of them was wrong. 3 men walked like men who work outside, heels first, wide. The 4th walked short and quick and kept stopping. At the corner of the shed, the motion light came on, and Abram, standing inside a dark kitchen, watched 4 shadows stretch across his own backyard and saw 4 men flinch and turn their faces. Then they came to the mudroom door. The first attempt on that door was a shoulder, and it failed, because a 3-inch screw into a stud does not care about a shoulder. The second was a pry bar in the jamb, and the wood screamed. The third took the frame apart at the top hinge, and the door came in flat and loud into a 28-inch hallway. Later, on the stand, the state's use of force expert would spend an hour explaining what happened in the next 50 seconds, using a diagram of Abram's hallway, and the jury would watch the diagram and not the man. What actually happened was simpler than the diagram. The first man through a broken door is always carrying the tool he broke it with. That man was Tolbert, 26, $300 into a $40,000 job, and he came through the opening at a slight lean, with a pry bar in his right hand and his left arm up against the wood. Abram did not hit him. That is the part everyone gets wrong about the men who actually know how. He took the wrist that had the bar in it, turned with it instead of against it, and put Tolbert into his own doorframe with Tolbert's own momentum, and then took the bar out of a hand that had gone loose and stepped back so the second man could come into the same 18 inches of space that now had a body in it. Gaskins came in over his partner and got a hallway, a bookcase, and a man who had spent 16 years teaching federal officers how to fight where there is no room to swing. It lasted 4 seconds. Gaskins came to rest against the baseboard with his own jacket pulled down over his shoulders, which is an old, ugly, extremely effective trick for turning a coat into handcuffs. And then it went wrong, because Rourke had not gone to the back door at all. Rourke had gone around the house. The kitchen light came on behind Abram, and a voice said, "Hey." Abram turned into a 9mm pistol at 11 feet, held by a man standing in his kitchen with his back to the stove and the front door open behind him. 11 feet is a long way. Anyone who tells you a man can cross 11 feet before a trigger moves is selling a seminar. So Abram did not cross it. He said, in a completely ordinary voice, "There's a kid in the house." Rourke said, "Shut up." Abram said, "I'm not moving. I'm telling you. There's an 8-year-old in this house. You've got 11 years in Pendleton on your sheet, and you're standing in a house with a gun and a child in it. That's not the job you took." And Rourke, for 1 second, looked toward the stairs. Abram had spent 22 years telling students the same thing in 100 different ways. You do not win by being faster than a gun. You win by making the gun look somewhere else, and then by owning the wrist, because the gun is not the threat. The wrist is the threat, and a wrist is a mechanical joint with a very short list of things it is willing to do. The pistol went across the kitchen floor and under the stove, and Rourke went down onto the linoleum with his arm at an angle arms do not go, and Abram was already turning, because he had heard the 4th set of footsteps, and they were not in the hallway anymore. They were on the stairs. The 4th man was wearing a ski mask that did not fit, and boots with no scuff on them, and a jacket that had been dry cleaned. Underneath a house full of broken wood and January air, Abram could smell cedar. Griffith Sutherland was halfway up the staircase with Rourke's dropped flashlight in his hand, and he was moving toward the sound of a little girl crying behind a door. He turned when Abram hit the bottom step, and he said, through the mask, in a voice that had gone up an octave, "I just need one of them. I just need one of them to walk out with me." Somewhere out on the county road there were sirens. Here is what the forensic reconstruction established, and what 4 separate people confirmed, and what a grand jury heard in 90 minutes before they declined to charge Abram Duvall with anything at all. Abram took the stairs 3 at a time. Sutherland swung the flashlight. Abram took it on the forearm, closed the distance to 0, and turned him away from the upstairs hallway, which was the entire objective, because the objective was never the man. The objective was the door behind him. Sutherland's momentum took him into the stair rail. The rail was original to the house, spindles from 1961, and it did what a 60-year-old rail does. He went over it backward and fell 9 feet onto a hardwood floor, and he landed the way people land when they have never learned how, with his head first and nothing else. He did not get up. Abram went up the last 4 stairs, put his hand flat on his daughter's closet door, and said, "It's Dad. It's over. Don't open it yet." Then he came back down and turned on every light in the house and knelt next to Griffith Sutherland and started chest compressions on the man who had come to his home to watch him die. He was still doing them when the front door came in for the second time that night. The sheriff's team came through with lights and shouting, the way they are trained to, and what they found was this. 3 men on the floor of the back hall and kitchen, secured, none of them standing, one of them still trying to figure out where his own coat had gone. A 4th man on the hardwood at the bottom of the stairs, with a stranger's hands on his chest. And a 47-year-old refrigeration contractor in a t-shirt saying, over and over, 30 seconds out, somebody take over. I've got 2 kids upstairs in a closet. And in the front doorway, in a wool coat, with her car still running in the drive, and her phone in her hand, stood Abram Duvall. She had come home at 9:56, 9 minutes early, because she could not wait in a parking lot in town for 1 more minute, and because she had a story ready about a showing that ran late, and because she needed to be the one who found him. She stood pressed against the wall of her own entryway and looked at the men on her floor, and at her husband's hands, and at the shape at the bottom of the stairs, with the mask pushed halfway up, showing silver at the temples. She was shaking so hard that the phone came out of her hand and hit the floor. 2 deputies had her by the arms. A paramedic was already on the floor with Sutherland. Somebody was reading rights to Roark. There was that specific, unbearable noise a house makes when 11 people are in it, and nobody knows what to say. Abram stood up. He crossed the entryway, and the deputies let him, because nobody in that room had processed yet who was who. He leaned in until he was close enough to speak under all of it. Lattimore was 4 feet away. She testified to every word. He said, "You hired 4 men to come into this house and kill a father in front of his own children." He said, "In 14 years, you never once asked me what I did for 22 years before I met you. Not once. You decided what I was, and you never checked." He said, "You were wrong about me." And then he looked past her, at the bottom of the stairs, where a paramedic had stopped compressions and was sitting back on his heels. He said, "But you weren't wrong that somebody dies in this house tonight. You just guessed the wrong name." Griffith Sutherland was pronounced at 11:04 that night at Bartow County General. The coroner ruled it accidental blunt force trauma from a fall, sustained during the commission of a felony he was a participant in, and the grand jury took 90 minutes to decline any charge against Abram Duvall, most of which they spent watching a video of Sutherland handing an envelope to Dermot Kepler in a gravel yard in December. Abram Duvall was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and felony murder. Because in Indiana, when somebody dies during a felony you set in motion, the death belongs to you no matter whose feet were on the stairs. Her attorney was expensive and did the only thing there was to do, which was to argue that a criminal named Kepler had manufactured a story to blackmail a wealthy developer, and that a frightened woman had been recorded saying reckless things she never intended anyone to act on. That argument survived until the 4th day of trial, when the state played 17 minutes of a parked car in Terre Haute. The jury heard her explain the gravel drive. They heard her say there were no guns in the house. They heard Dermot Kepler, on tape, say the word kids, and they heard her answer that they'd be upstairs, that they'd hear it, that nobody argues with a child. And then they heard her laugh. A juror told a reporter afterward that the laugh was the whole trial. Everything else was paper, she said. The laugh was a person. Bridget Whitcomb sat behind her daughter every day in a series of good coats and told a television crew on the courthouse steps that Abram Duvall had turned a family tragedy into a performance. Wheeler Whitcomb started a fundraiser. It raised $1,100 and was taken down after the tape leaked. The defense's last theory was the one everybody had been waiting for, and it was the one that broke in the most spectacular way. Motive, they said, was absurd, because a woman in the middle of a 9-figure land deal would have to be insane to blow it up, and the state had shown no financial gain. Maricela Brogan called Lisbeth Mercier to the stand. Mercier explained, in the flat voice of a woman who has read a lot of documents out loud, that on the 7th of November, 2 months before the offense, Abram Duvall had irrevocably transferred 214 acres in Strawn Hollow, plus his business, into a trust for his two minor children, that he had retained no interest, that the trust contained a slayer provision, and that in the event of the children's deaths, the property passed entirely to a conservancy. Brogan asked, on the night of January 23rd, if Abram Duvall had died, what would his wife have inherited? Mercier said, the house, the vehicles, and approximately $11,000. Brogan asked, and the land? Mercier said, the land was never his to leave, not since November. They turned a monitor toward the defense table so the exhibit could be displayed, and the whole courtroom watched Deanna Duvall read a document dated 6 weeks before she ever sat in a car in Terre Haute, and watched her understand that the thing she ordered a man killed for had already stopped existing before she priced him. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 65 years. Rourke took a plea and testified. Tolbert and Gaskins took pleas. Dermot Kepler pleaded guilty to conspiracy, served 14 months, and now runs a demolition crew in Terre Haute with a plaque in the office that his employees think is a joke, which reads, "The loudest man in the room is never the most dangerous one." Ransom Pelletier foreclosed on 2 strip centers and never met any of these people. The one fight Abram Duvall picked in that entire courtroom was over his children. The state wanted Landry on the stand. He had heard the door. He had heard his father's voice through it. Brogan argued it would take 20 minutes and would end any question about the closet. Abram told her no. He told her he had spent 5 weeks letting professionals build a case around his family, and he had given them everything they asked for, and this was the one thing he was keeping. He said, "My son locked a door because I asked him to." He is not going to spend the rest of his life being the boy who testified against his mother. Brogan tried the case without them and won it anyway. The paper stars are still taped to the window of Kimber Duvall's room, and the storm room is still behind her closet, and nobody in that house calls it the bunker anymore. They moved 11 months later to a smaller place with a bigger shop, and the hallway in the new house is a normal width, because Abram thought about it for a long time and then decided that a man can only build so much of his life around a door. He did not sell Strawn Hollow. He could not have if he had wanted to, which he says now was the point. The state built its interchange a mile and a half north, on ground owned by a man who was happy to sell, and the hollow stayed hills and hardwood and a creek that runs clear in August. The gravel seam is still down there, 11 feet under, doing nothing, waiting for 2 kids to be old enough to decide. Last summer, Landry Duvall, 13, took a chisel out to the barn without asking, climbed into the loft, and carved his sister's initials into the beam under his great-grandfather's, crooked and too deep, and then his own under hers. His dad found it 2 weeks later, standing in the dust with his hand on the wood, and did not say anything about the chisel marks at all. Abram still fixes ice machines. He still answers the phone. There is a drawing taped inside the door of the van, done by an 8-year-old who is now 10, of a man under a big square machine with a wrench, and above him, in enormous letters, "My dad can fix anything." A customer asked him once, standing in the walk-in of a diner at 6 in the morning, what he did before all this. And Abram Duvall said, "I taught people how to survive the worst 10 seconds of their lives." The customer laughed, because it sounded like a joke. Abram let him. So that's the story, and I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to walk away from this one thinking the lesson is that you should know how to fight, and that's not it. That's not close to it. Look at what actually saved that family. It wasn't the hallway. It wasn't 22 years of instruction, though God knows that mattered at 9:41 on a Thursday. What saved those 2 kids was a signature on a Monday in November, made by a tired man who did not yet know he was in danger, and who asked one boring question anyway. If I'm not here, who does this hurt? That trust did something no fist ever could. It made his death worthless. She could still have gone through with it, and she did. But by the time she did, the whole machine she'd built ran downhill into nothing. That's not violence. That's an hour with a lawyer and $300. And the other half of it is the part that should genuinely bother us, because it's the part most of us are guilty of in smaller ways. She lived with that man for 14 years and never asked him a single real question about his life. She looked at a work van and filled in the rest herself, and every year she was more certain and less curious. Contempt does that. It feels like knowledge and it's actually a blindfold, and she wore it right up until the moment it cost her everything. So here's what I'd take out of this one. Ask the people you love what they used to be, while you still have the chance to be surprised by them. Do the boring paperwork that protects the people who can't protect themselves, and be very, very careful about anyone you've decided is small, because the quietest guy in the room usually got quiet for a reason. If this one got you, hit that like button, tell me in the comments what you'd have done differently, and I'll see you in the next story.